Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. It's been just over 2 weeks since the American electorate made their voices heard, with Donald Trump securing a commanding victory in the presidential race. On this episode, we speak with Norman Roule, former senior CIA operations officer and Middle East expert, to break down what this means for the future of US foreign policy. Can President-elect Trump deliver on his promises to swiftly end the wars in Ukraine and Gaza? What will his victory mean for the crisis in Gaza and the future of US-Saudi relations? And how will his approach to the Middle East reshape America's role on the global stage? Mr. Roule, thank you for joining us once again on Frankly Speaking. Great to have you back on the show. Now, last November the 5th, just a couple of weeks ago, the American public spoke and they voted, with the majority of them choosing to put Mr. Trump back into the White House as the next US president. Now, frankly speaking, many polls were predicting a very close race. Were you then surprised by the outcome? And what was it, do you think, that gave Mr. Trump such a majority win?
Well, thank you for having me. The polls have indeed been proven wrong once again, and that's important because polling in this election, the previous election, and the prior election before that were wrong. My sense was that the Harris campaign was not doing well, largely because the trend line for the Trump campaign in the last several weeks of the election was moving fairly consistently in one direction and up. And in US presidential elections, in the last few weeks of the election, that trend line often tells you where things are going to land.
Well, it certainly was a majority win, wasn't it? With a big focus on domestic policies, improving the economy as well. And I want to ask you about the domestic issues in just a moment. But first, let's focus on foreign affairs, because as we know, throughout his campaign, Mr. Trump repeatedly pledged that he would very quickly end the wars in both Ukraine and Gaza. Now, we all know he likes a deal and that he operates quite differently than any other president. But tell me, do you think he has the ability today to be able to pull a rabbit out of a hat to that extent?
Well, you're correct. President Trump does see himself as a deal maker, and he assigns to key positions around him individuals with the same worldview. So you're going to get individuals who are generally sympathetic towards Israel, confident of the strong U.S. relationship with the Gulf Cooperation Council states, willing to deter Iran, willing to do what it takes to keep the United States out of regional conflicts, but willing also to push back on adversaries. President Trump does not want to see the United States in a war in the Middle East or in Europe any more than President Biden. How they approach those issues are quite different. I think President Trump's position is the world is giving a massive amount of aid to Ukraine to defend itself, but it's not winning the war. Does this conflict just go on forever? Is that the plan? President Trump's goal appears to be, how do we bring some sort of agreement together that stops the killing and restores the diplomatic channel so that we can bring about peace in Europe? With Iran, it's probably similar. Iran needs to reduce its nuclear program, cease its regional adventurism, and act like a normal nation. If Iran is willing to do this, as we've seen in the previous Trump administration, they will offer engagement. But if not, in either of these cases, what you're going to see is likely the Trump administration not unwilling to provide Ukraine with more weapons because Russia won't cooperate, and also to conduct significant pressure against Iran.
Well, let me ask you a little bit more on Ukraine there, because I think the big concern is that, frankly, we saw America give Afghanistan back to the Taliban. So is there not a big concern for many Ukrainians and Europeans who have invested so much into this war that Mr. Trump and his policies risk prioritizing Russia in a deal and then essentially forcing it upon Kiev, the EU, as well as NATO too?
Well, to be clear, I supported extending the U.S. and international presence in Afghanistan. But in fairness to the decision makers, America had invested more than $1 trillion in Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands of Americans over a generation, 2 generations, had fought and risked their lives in Afghanistan for the Afghan people. At a certain point, it is not unreasonable to say it's up to the Afghans to build the direction of their country. But as I say, I think the international community, the United States, should have stayed. If you take that to Ukraine, the Trump administration's position is going to be if this is an existential issue for Europe, then it must act accordingly. And there are some countries in Europe which still will not meet their NATO obligations. The Trump administration's position is going to be, not unreasonably, if this is existential for us and we must participate accordingly, why isn't it existential for you? Within Ukraine itself, this is a costly, bloody war. They've lost many of their people to Russian aggression. This is a criminal invasion of another country. That said, if you're interested in stopping the violence, at some point, all wars come to a diplomatic solution. They may not be attractive, but that solution is needed. I think the Trump position is going to be, where does this end? And is it just an endless black hole of money and blood to keep things going?
Certainly no easy answers there. And it was interesting, of course, Mr. Putin came out and endorsed Vice President Harris. But of course, there is the big concern that Mr. Trump is ready to end the war in Ukraine, potentially at what cost we don't yet know. Let me ask you.
If I could just add one more point on President Trump, it is true that many will say that he has an unusual approach to President Putin. But in fairness to the Trump administration, the previous administration, they were the toughest administration in at least 30 years, if not ever, against Russia. They pushed Europe to increase its expenditure in NATO. Russia certainly wouldn't wanted that. The Trump administration and the president himself pushed Germany to cut its economic ties with energy with Russia. And last, the United States led a highly successful effort to expel hundreds of Russian intelligence officers from around the world. So if it is fair to say that President Trump seeks a relationship with Vladimir Putin to reach a deal, it is also fair to say that he is has one of the toughest tangible approaches to Russia we've seen in many years. And I think that's going to continue.
So you are expecting a more aggressive approach to Russia again, of course, because Mr. Trump has also come out very blatantly and many times blamed President Zelensky of Ukraine for the war. But you're expecting another similar aggressive approach to Russia this time, you say even more.
I think we should expect President Trump to look for a deal, to look for peace, to look for each side to make concessions, to look for a way the United States can help, but he will protect American interests just as he did in 2016. The rhetoric will be unusual for many and not part of traditional diplomatic discourse. And of course, that will unsettle people. But in Ukraine itself, and again, I have been a supporter of providing U.S. aid to Ukraine. They need to finish the job, or this becomes an endless conflict, and the Trump administration won't support that.
Well, let's focus on the question that has no easy answer, and that is Gaza. Now, many Arab Americans voted for Trump in retaliation for the real failure of the Biden administration to contain the escalating situation in the Middle East. And now there's a real worry that many Trump nominees for senior positions are very pro-Israeli, and that Mr. Trump's policies might actually end up worsening the situation rather than resolving it. Tell me, is that something that you're concerned about?
Well, it does, but again, in fairness, I think we need to unpack that. It is certainly true that many of the Trump senior designees are openly pro-Israel, but their rhetoric as to what they would do to support Israel is no different than the Biden administration itself. What I do think we can look forward to is the Trump administration is not looking to involve the United States or Israel or the region in an endless conflict in Gaza. If there is a difference between the Biden approach and the Trump approach, I think the Trump approach might be more of to the Israeli government, do what you feel is necessary, but do it efficiently, humanely, and quickly. We're not looking to support Israel for an endless war there itself. Now, this said, the answers to this conflict are simple if complicated to achieve. First, we must provide humanitarian relief to the Palestinian people who have suffered tremendously, largely because of Hamas's use of this population as human sacrifice. But we must bring in international aid and end the conflict. But at the same time, we must end the role of Hamas in threatening Israel. It's not unfair that Israel seeks the security to prevent another repetition of October 7th. This leads to the issue of a two-state solution. And if that's going to be difficult with the Israelis, you just have to imagine yourself right now. Is the president of the Palestinian Authority capable politically of bringing the Palestinians to a two-state solution? Will Hamas tolerate that? And indeed, the question that we all should ask ourselves is, if two-state discussions began today, what would Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Iran, and the Houthis say about that? Would they support those talks? Would they try to upend those talks? I think the great unanswered question is, what is the international community doing to provide space so that when we achieve a two-state diplomatic approach, as difficult as that will be, we actually are able to protect that approach from the malign actions of Iran and its proxies?
And I will say, you know, just to pick up on something you said there in terms of Hamas's actions, again, I think we also have to put it into perspective. Again, this is a decades-long conflict, and as much as the events of October 7 were shocking, we're talking around 1,200 people killed, a couple of hundred hostages taken, devastating situation. But we look at the death toll of the Palestinians that continues to rise. This has now spread to Lebanon as well. So in terms of finding, I think you said, an efficient and humane end to this conflict, so far, I would say Israel has not necessarily proved itself capable of that. So let's focus specifically on Lebanon. And I think that many observers are torn between comments made by people like Biden's advisor, Amos Hochstein, who says that peace is within grasp. Now, this is in dramatic contrast to someone like Michael Freund. He was Mr. Netanyahu's deputy director of communications. And in a recent Jerusalem Post column, he said that the border between Israel and Lebanon is entirely artificial and created by European colonialists. He said actually that that specific geographical area belongs to Israel. Tell me, what are your sources telling you about Lebanon?
So there is much harsh rhetoric coming from all sides. Lebanese Hezbollah, elements of the Israeli government, and Palestinians themselves on all of these issues. Regarding Lebanon, again, there's a simple solution with a difficult approach to get there. We need first to remove Lebanese Hezbollah north of Litani, to empower the Lebanese armed forces to come south of Litani and do their job and be able to do so without fear of Lebanese Hezbollah, and then to empower the United Nations peacekeepers who have failed to do their job completely. Indeed, it's a question, why are they there now? They're just incapable of providing peace to do their same job. On the border, I would disagree with the Israeli official. And in fact, there are elements of the border, not a large region, but a significant area, nonetheless, for the Lebanese, that are undefined. And we need to have that border issue resolved. But the first priority is end the conflict, end the suffering of the Lebanese people, and the suffering of the Israeli people. 60,000 Israelis have left their home. And prior to the Lebanese recent conflict, 100,000 Lebanese were not going into their homes. And now we have 1 million displaced Lebanese. We've got to make that our first priority. But in fairness to Israel, you cannot have this situation end with Lebanese Hezbollah being reconstituted by Iran or Hamas being reconstituted by Iran. And that challenge requires a security component, which the Biden administration feels confident can happen. But in the end of the day, the Lebanese people must be willing to stand up against Lebanese Hezbollah. This isn't something that we're going to be able to do. And I'll close by saying that one bit of diplomatic guidance that in the intelligence community we often give to diplomats is, we can't want a solution more than the people on the ground. The Lebanese people must appoint a president, empower their armed forces, push back on Lebanese Hezbollah. We will assist them and support them, provide them with billions of dollars of aid. But at a certain point, the political solution must be their own.
But do you think there is a real ability to be able to elect a Lebanese leader at the moment? You know, when you talk about the political stalemate that Lebanon has endured for so long, obviously Hezbollah is so deeply ingrained in so many parts of everyday life in Lebanon. Do you think that the people actually have the ability themselves to be able to break through that?
I'm not sure that even Lebanese leadership knows the answer to that question, but there are many examples in history of countries that have taken dramatic steps to change the DNA of their political makeup. And going back to my previous comment regarding Iran and a peace solution with between the Palestinians and Israel, Iran's primary goal, ironically, is diplomacy at present. It's looking for a ceasefire in Lebanon and Gaza because it will enable itself to reconstitute Lebanese Hezbollah. So we need some sort of approach that keeps Iran out of Lebanon as well, to buy space for the Lebanese people to do what they need to restore their country's sovereignty.
And of course, that is a real priority for Saudi as well. So let's focus on Saudi-US relations. Of course, you are a major expert on that subject. Now, we've seen recently that the kingdom's foreign minister has made it very clear that normalization with Israel is off the table. Now, Riyadh is adamant we must stop the war and secure a global recognition of a Palestinian statehood first. Tell me, how would you rate the Saudi diplomatic efforts, and how helpful do you think the Arab Islamic unification position is for the incoming administration?
So the Saudi foreign minister's position has been consistent, it's been clear, and it's been directed to achieve what the entire Arab world seeks: a two-state solution that is fair to the Palestinian people, that allows security for Israel, and does not provide undue diplomatic recognition or other inducements to Israel before that diplomatic solution of the two-state relationship comes about. So I'm a big fan of Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan. I think his comments have been appropriate, and the comments of the Saudi leadership have also been quite clear. The problem remains for the United States and for the Saudi government. We have a separate relationship that needs to progress at the same time. And in fairness, it's been doing quite well in recent months. We have a massive technological cooperation that's ongoing, particularly in artificial intelligence. The issue of data centers is coming to the forefront of the relationship, but also as the Biden administration was working on its strategic agreement with the Saudi government, the sense in Washington is the movement of that deal was quite positive. And was only upended by the Gaza conflict. Now, this said, although the strategic agreement as a whole may be upended, I think we're going to see continued progress on elements of that deal that provides Saudi Arabia and the United States with what they need to maintain and build what is a very positive and critical relationship for the United States and for the region.
Mm-hmm. Of course, that deal was so close to being signed earlier this year. As you mentioned, it was really only the recent conflict that has put that on hold. Tell me, do you think that parts of the deal, potentially those that are not related to Israel, can still be implemented?
Absolutely. And I believe both the Biden administration in its remaining time and the Trump administration will seek to do so. Saudi Arabia must have what it needs to achieve its vision as a global node of progress, stability, interfaith relationships. And if you look at the map, and I often ask people to think in space, Saudi Arabia, the GCC as a whole, is located in the center of so many pathways of global commerce and social exchange between India and Africa, between Europe and Asia. These are incredibly important areas that must be knitted together, and Saudi Arabia is in the middle.
And do you think parts of this deal will be able to be completed under the Biden administration, or do you think it's more likely to progress when the new Trump administration takes over?
I think it's likely that you're going to see continued progress on green energy, on artificial intelligence issues, on cooperation in Africa, which is very important for the stability of the region. And of course, our engagement with Saudi Arabia as a focal point for the Organization of the Islamic Conference of for the Muslim World League, for the Arab League, and other organizations. I think you're going to see continued progress in those areas as well in the Biden administration's last few months. Now, when the Trump administration comes in, it has all the reason in the world to continue Saudi Arabia's stabilizing role, Saudi Arabia's central role in trade and communications and energy in the international community, Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States on artificial intelligence. And indeed, I predict, and I shouldn't do that because even in my old job, intelligence officers should never predict. I predict the artificial intelligence engagement between the United States and Saudi Arabia will be one of the most consequential and impactful relationships in the history of U.S.-Saudi ties, going back to the energy discoveries of the 1930s.
Wow, incredible. And of course, our Middle Eastern leaders and Mr. Trump enjoyed a close relationship previously, and we are expecting that to continue and progress. Tell me, when we talk about Saudi Arabia, this is a much lighter note. I noticed that you recently had shared a video of none other than Jennifer Lopez, who was performing recently in Riyadh. And I think in many ways, this openness that really characterizes the new Saudi Arabia is often criticized as image washing. And I think what's particularly ironic is that these criticisms often come from the very same people in the West who have previously criticized Saudi for being too closed or restrictive. As someone who is an expert on the region, do you feel that in many respects, Saudi Arabia is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't?
Well, there are certain polities who will never be satisfied, I think, with anything that happens in Saudi Arabia or other countries. The bad news is they have a loud voice at times. The good news is they have very little influence over policy. You don't hear these voices standing in the way of green energy cooperation, artificial intelligence, the presence of U.S. military forces in the region, things that really matter. These voices had no role in shaping those actions. That was an extraordinary fashion show, but truth be told, I see so much that is extraordinary in Saudi Arabia that the extraordinary has become the ordinary. And what is most important for me is realizing this is important for the Saudi people. I think there's such a regional role for this influence. The role of protecting women's rights is not just a Saudi issue, but I'd like to see Saudi Arabia's influence touch Afghanistan, touch Africa, the social engagements that come with concerts and entertainment, the cross-cultural fertilization. Saudi Arabia is ideally located because of its geography to have this major impact in countries and societies in Asia and Africa, as well as better promoting understanding with Europe and the United States. So it's great. I was in Saudi Arabia at the time of that event, but I was not able to attend.
And of course, just to touch on a personal note, as a Western woman who's been based in the Gulf for more than 15 years, I still think there's so much more to talk about than just the progress of women's rights, particularly when it comes to somewhere like Saudi. I know you've been in the kingdom this week. In fact, you were visiting NEOM, I understand. Tell me a little bit about your understanding and appreciation of why you feel this project is set to be such a game changer for the kingdom.
So when I explain NEOM to people in the United States, I lay out a few points which are often not understood. First, Saudi Arabia's population is growing rapidly. Anybody who has been in Riyadh for the last decade has watched 1.5 million people suddenly appear in the city. Now, the kingdom is doing great work with the subway system and other facilities, but nonetheless, the kingdom is going to need a new city. And that's important. The second issue is I ask people to look in space. Just look at the concept of a map, and you see Europe, you see Northwest Saudi Arabia, you see Riyadh, Jeddah, you see the Emirates, maybe Oman, Bahrain, and then you move on to Asia itself, India and Asia. NEOM is 90 minutes from Athens. It's about 60 kilometers from the Suez Canal. It's part of an area that includes Sharm el-Sheikh and Petra. And then, as I say, it has an airport that can connect to Riyadh and these other locations. So you're building a chain. Last, if you're looking for security for communications, for energy, for transport, having a port or other facilities in NEOM allows you to avoid the risk associated with the Red Sea itself. Those are all very, very important. Where the kingdom, I think, is doing something that is incredible and often provokes doubt in the West is if you talk to the leadership of NEOM about the various programs, And some of the programs are ahead of schedule. Some will fall behind as they moderate and rather modulate their programs to match technologies. So much of this has never been done before anywhere in the world. And Saudi Arabia could create a new city tomorrow, pour concrete, build buildings, do the same thing. It's building a city that is meant to be carbon zero or carbon negative. It's building a port that will transform Oxagon, the port, through with 1.5 million containers capacity, transport trade in the region. But how you do this with technologies that simply have never existed, it's hard, and therefore I expect delays. When people talk about the line, which is often how NEOM is described in the West, I tell them first, NEOM is the size of Belgium or Massachusetts. Only 5% of the territory can be developed, and I think they've mapped out about 4%. The concept of a line city is not new. It's a 19th century Italian concept, and indeed, Manhattan itself is a line city. The only difference is in Saudi Arabia, it's folding up the edges of those lines to form sort of a U, and that's novel and extraordinary and requires some very new engineering and new and environmentally friendly procedures. But if you speak to the leadership of NEOM, you speak to the heads of the various programs, you sense not only their excitement, but their attraction to these challenges. And these are people from a variety of countries who are dedicated to working there. Last, when people talk about NEOM, it's got about 5,000 employees, but about 200,000 people live there. It's got an active hospital. Babies are being born in NEOM. They will have NEOM on their birth certificate. You've got a functioning airport. You have Safeways. The city itself is starting to appear, but it will grow organically over time. I have no doubt it's going to succeed. It will be amazing, but it may not succeed on the schedule that some might hope.
And of course, these huge giga projects, they take time when we're doing something that has never been created before. But of course, on this program, you have previously criticised the kingdom for not doing enough to be able to really share its narrative and to stop, and allowing falsehoods to spread. Tell me, what more do you think can be done, in your opinion?
So it is not my place to criticize the kingdom, but I will make a comment and say that programs such as this, perhaps with better guests, and explaining the kingdom in English to the international community is critical. When you're looking at the news, the editorials of the Arab news, this program that you so professionally execute routinely, I just want more of it. And I think the world needs more of it, not just to understand what the kingdom is doing in and of itself, but how those ambitions will shape the global society and the global economy. Understanding Saudi Arabia's investments in green energy, along with those of the United Arab Emirates, it's critical to the future of the planet for developing countries, for the global north and the global south. Understanding how entertainment connects Europe to Asia, it's going to shape how people move in the world. That can only be done with more information being put out. And the Arabic language is beautiful and it is extraordinary, but it is difficult for many Americans. And it would be great if we had an English language channel to give the Saudi and Arab perspective, as the Arab news does.
Well,
And you do
watch this
with every
space.
one of your Arab news.
I'll be sure to pass your message on to our editor-in-chief, that is for sure. I think, something to pick up on what you said about, I think getting the message out there, I think what is key in that is bringing more executives, bringing more entrepreneurs and investors to Riyadh as well. And that's something that certainly the current ambassador, Michael Ratney, has been doing a fantastic job of. In fact, he gave his first interview out of Saudi to this very program. He's also been involved in signing some really exciting MOUs. And I think what is so remarkable about his work is that it's taken place at a time when the current US administration really was quite hostile to the kingdom. So tell me, what is your projection on bilateral ties on that front?
So Michael Ratney is not only experienced, superb Arabist, but he's someone who has a deep knowledge and understanding and respect for the region. He's exactly the sort of ambassador the United States would hope to have in a position as consequential as this. At the same time, you have Ambassador Rima bin Bandar in Washington, who is extremely capable, She is a national treasure, I think, for both of our countries as we look to understand and work together. And each of these individuals has indeed encouraged these executives to come to Saudi Arabia. And I have been with such executives at some of these meetings, and they are, if they're fresh to the kingdom, they're delighted and amazed. If they don't come often, they're delighted and amazed. But if I can criticize that group for a moment, it's also incumbent upon them to come back to America or Europe or wherever they originate and to talk about what they see, not just the changes, but the ambition of the kingdom and where this is going. Because the success that we all hope to achieve is not a business deal. It's a partnership on the broader ambitions of the kingdom and the United States for regional stability and progress. And we rarely have an opportunity in history to work with a country that is doing what Saudi Arabia is doing today.
And certainly there's been tremendous progress on both sides. We see such a different position from Mr. Biden in the early days threatening to turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah state. Certainly a very different position we're in today. But final question, if we can focus on domestic US politics for just a moment. Now, I think for far too long, America has been divided in an unprecedented way. Do you see that the Trump 2.0 administration is now more able to bridge that gap? Do they risk widening it more than ever? And what do you make of some of his appointments so far? Particularly, we've seen a rather unusual role for Elon Musk emerging.
I think President Trump has a worldview that he seeks in those individuals around him. And Elon Musk has been highly successful doing things that many people thought was impossible, with far less resources in some ways than people thought were possible. What he's done with X, he reduced the staff. What he did in the space programs was with less resources than possible. He's willing to accept failure and risk in doing these things. That's, if I may say, that's a very American approach. A problem that's just solved by throwing a lot of money at it may not be a problem, but a problem solved by imagination and innovation is needed. The U.S. government is large. Not my place to criticize how that works, but large isn't always better, and reducing the size of the U.S. government is something every administration should look at. Our society is changing. It's younger. It has different views. It gets its information in different ways. Going back to my point of I need you 7 hours a day on an international television station, frankly, as an anchor, putting these stories out. Because if not, our society will draw that information from sources that echo their own views, but don't actually build the worldview that we need. I'm not sure President Trump can overcome that. But he has an opportunity to do so. And for Saudi Arabia, as part of this broader dynamic, it basically becomes the narrative of success. I should close by saying that Saudi Arabia was not mentioned in the last election. And that's probably a good thing, because you want elections to be about domestic issues. When a foreign country is named, it's done for political reasons. And I think the lack of any role of Saudi Arabia in the elections tells you that both sides of the political debate see Saudi Arabia as the solution, not the problem.
Certainly a very different stance to President Biden when we saw him several years ago vowing to turn Saudi into a pariah state. Certainly is a very different feeling, I think, towards the kingdom these days. But Mr. Roule, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the program again, and we appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much.